This film first premiered in the fall of last year at the Hawaii International Film Festival. And since then, it's gone through a change. As the film says, we continue to find new information and new stories about Hawaii's confinement sites. And one of the new facts we found is the location of the Kalaheo Stockade. Can you share with the audience our search for the Kalaheo Stockade?
Thank you. First of all, aloha everyone. Aloha. We're so glad that you're here and you're interested and you have now heard some of the untold stories of the Japanese and Hawaii World War II internment in Hawaii. There's a lot of stuff out on the mainland internment experience, but we are really, as Carol said, beginning to uncover more and more stories about the Hawaii internment. And actually, the search for the Kalaheo Stockade began in 2006. And there are a number of you out there today who was on that search with us.
Who helped in 2006? Okay, there's a hand back there. And actually in the credits, there were a number of Kauai folks listed in the credits.
Right. And we were up. I mean, we were down from the Allerton Garden all the way up to the There's Chicken Farm with Taruichi Marugami at the time, who was an actual internee at the Kalaheo Stockade. And he pointed it out, and we were there with Mary, as you saw, Mary Farrell and Jeff Burton, the National Park archaeologist. However, at that time, because we had no maps and no official documentation, it was still sort of left in limbo. It was not conclusive. And so we were so lucky in 2012,
just last year.
Right, November.
Just last year.
Right. And this time we had a little group from JCCH, and some of you must know Wayne Jacinto from Kalaheo Hunter, and well, he works part-time at the Kauai Museum, with him leading the group. And we had a new friend and benefactor, Wayne Raposo, joined the group. And we all set out one rainy day and really tried to hunt it down, to nail it down. However, at that time, we didn't have access to the Madeiras Chicken Farm. So what we did was we crawled and climbed and walked through the tropical forest area above it, and we got to look down into the site. And this time, we went armed with the personal description, the eyewitness description from Virgie Raposo. As a young girl, she had gone up there with Benny Silva. Benny Silva was a volunteer fireman at that time, and she was a very young girl. They went up, and they were in that forest area above the camp as well. And they got to look down into it, and she has a very good memory. She described what she saw. She saw the internees moving about. She could describe the barracks that they were in. She described the baseball field, and we actually were very pleased that we had done that search.
So we met Virgie Raposo through Wayne Jacinto.
Right.
And Virgie, to a T, described the photos that we had of Kalaheo Stockade.
Right.
So that was the only way we were to verify the precise location.
Yes.
It was quite a find.
Oh, it was, yes, it was really quite a find.
And every time we show the film, we find more stories, new stories, and more information, right?
Right, and just today, we had people coming with information that they had acquired, and that's what we really would like for you to do. If you hear about anyone, most of the original internees have passed on now. but their children have stories to tell. We have a really, really compelling story from Miyuki Asaoka, whose father was a priest at the Waimea Honsho something. Well, anyway, the Buddhist temple there, and she has a really, really, really compelling story to tell. And we will be sharing these on October 15th at the Teacher Institute Day for, the Kauai Teacher Institute Day. And we really, really would like for all of the social studies teachers especially, and we have a few in the audience today, to come to that session. We really want to connect with the Kauai internment stories and connect them with the units and the resources that we've collected and we will put in the high school.
Before we get into the teachers and what we're doing with the schools, I want to talk about this poster. So, Lloyd, can you talk about this poster a bit? You may have seen it in the lobby.
This poster was developed a few years ago, actually a year ago, and it lists all the known internees with Hawaii ties. Okay, we know that there are some errors or some missing names, and if you take the time to look through it, and you should find a name that needs correction, or you need one that's missing, we invite you to let us know, okay? Because we're constantly updating our files.
When we started this film project, I think the approximate number was about 1,800 internees of Japanese ancestry. And in less than a year, that it increased to about 2,300. And then taking this film from neighbor island to neighbor island, we've discovered even more names. So this is really an evolving story. But please, so many families have been able to locate their grandfather, great-grandfather's names on this poster. Now, Betsy touched upon what we're doing in the school, so let's continue with that discussion. And teachers in the audience, can we just, where are our teachers, high school teachers? So we have a few, great, thank you for coming.
I think it's really important that these guys take their time on a weekend to come out to learn more so that they can pass on the message to their students. So teachers, you're here, wave, stand.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here today. We've continued to promote not only the film, but we want to promote the story. We don't want this untold story to be the forgotten story. The state of Hawaii and through other fundraising efforts undertaken by the Japanese Cultural Center, we've raised enough money to make this film available to all high schools throughout the state. So 500 copies of this DVD will be available to our high school social studies teachers. The film, as well as the curriculum guide, other classroom materials, a book, photos for your classroom will be made available free of no charge. We want to get this out to our students. And Betsy, why don't you speak a little bit more about what your plans are in the next month?
Well,
working with the
we're
schools.
trying to develop this PowerPoint that captures the Kauai connections and extend upon them. And then we are linking it directly into or with the internment units that were created for modern history of Hawaii, U.S. history, and participating in a democracy. And because many of them have the Hawaii internment resources, but we're adding to it Kauai resources as well.
So the curriculum materials will be directly tied and linked to the core standards. Are there questions from the audience you'd like to ask any of us? Jane or Betsy? Any questions? Yes?
Do you have a list of Hawaii residents who were sent to camps on the mainland and where they were sent?
Do we have a list? This is the beginning of the list that we have. We have a list, and I think either of you can discuss this.
We have a list. We have a gentleman at the Resource Center who is bilingual, and there's a lot of material in Japanese. and he's able to translate them, of course, into English. But he has developed a master database of internees from Kauai, Maui, the Big Island, and we are looking for ways to get this out to folks so that they can check into their families or with their families. And again, maybe we can begin to identify people who we can get stories from, and the students in schools do a lot of oral history gathering. This would be an ideal activity, a learning activity for them.
So the list I know that I've seen, some of it identifies a former internee, where they were living, what they were doing, where they were sent. Now, some of the lists are based off of memoirs of the former internees. I think it's they weren't sure where they were going to go or what was going to happen to them, so they kept their own internal lists, documents. Some of the former internees were reporters or writers, so they kept very detailed lists, and we have those memoirs, and those are the documents that have been translated, and much of the research is based off of personal journals, memoirs, and letters that were sent back and forth.
I think there are people in the audience who knew Gladys Naito. Her father was very, very smart. He actually wrote a journal, and it was to document for her experience and his experience, the internment experience, because she was so young. And he actually drew a map of their travels or the way they were shuffled about on the mainland. And we will include that kind of documentation in the resource that we'll be sharing with the teachers and schools.
There's a question here, yes?
Where do you keep the archival material and maintain them so that they're not,
So the question is, where do we keep our archival materials and maintain them? Betsy and Lloyd.
We have a collection, and they're kept at the Japanese Cultural Center in Honolulu in the Resource Center, and very painstakingly we're trying to catalog everything and document everything. It's a long, long process, but they are working at it.
But it's available to the public. Recently, we had a group of people from Kauai who knew Gladys Naito. And they came, they sat around our table with all of her archival material, the family's material, and they reminisced because they really did miss her. One of the guys had actually said he remembers taking her to the junior prom. That was really something. But they spent the entire afternoon there going into the archival files on that family.
We do want to get all our archival materials online and available to the public. Currently, it is available and open to the public, but I think in the long run, it needs to be digitized, it needs to be accessible, and that is our goal. Yes.
About how many, do you know the percentage of the people who were originally interned in the islands that were sent to the mainland?
The number, do we know what the percentage or?
In Hawaii, they did a selective internment, whereas the mainland was the mass internment.
But how many were sent to Hawaii, to the mainland from here? Out of the 20?
Maybe 800 or so. But then, when families were left without any breadwinner, they were left without support. And so, they said it's voluntary, but many families had to join the father in camp, just like the Naitos, except it took a year and 3 months before they finally met up in the same camp. But just for survival, they joined the father in camp.
So many of the Hawaii internees that were sent to the mainland were first sent through Angel Island in San Francisco, and from Angel Island they were sent to a Department of Justice internment camp, which is different which is with Santa Fe. Many went to Santa Fe or Crystal City, Bismarck, before they were sent to maybe one of I call them more permanent 10 of the camps run by the War Relocation Authority. Many Hawaii residents ended up, internees were sent to Jerome, Arkansas.
Especially Kauai. somehow Kauai ended up with a larger percent of people interned as compared to the population in on Oahu or the other islands. And it's because we had no paid counselor, help, or worker here. So people like Reverend Osumi served in that capacity. They were not paid necessarily, but because they did the kinds of transactions and communications, because he was fluent in English and Japanese, he could do it. The complex process of expatriating and dropping the Japanese citizenship, he helped them with this.
Can you share, there's some very unique stories that came out of Kauai. Can you share the one story of the single internee that was imprisoned in...
Muraoka, and I was wondering if Darlene came today, and I wondered if she were related to him. But unfortunately for Paul Muraoka,
What did he do? What did he do?
insurance man, well, when they picked him up, they put him in the Lihue Plantation gym shower room.
The gym shower room.
And he spent a month there, solitary detainment, and he thought maybe they had forgotten about him, and the only reason why he knew they hadn't is someone would come and push food at him 3 times a day. But can you imagine, he was actually glad to get sent to Kalaheo Stockade, because he was in solitary.
I think one of the things that we learned is that there were about, I heard the number being 80 people from Kauai that were interned. The problem was there were 80 people that were supposed to be picked up immediately on December 7th, but there were only 2 FBI agents. So it happened over a period of time. Okay, and initially they were sent to Wailua,
Wailua County Jail. In the old days, we used to call it what? Do you remember? Montgomery Hotel, right? Because the warden was Montgomery.
So
Other questions?
Yeah.
Yes. The Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. Yes. Yes, we have a connection with the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. We will be showing this film in Los Angeles with Jano in late October.
Yeah, because she had some things that my grandfather had published or something, and at that time there wasn't anywhere else to send it, but there. So
We'll look into that.
And your grandfather was?
Yokota.
yeah.
We'll check the poster. Yokota. Thank you. Thank you.
But there wasn't anywhere else to send it, so I think that's what it is.
Do you know his profession? Do you know what he did?
I think just from the start, I heard he was like a Japanese school teacher.
Oh, that's right here.
He's on the poster.
But that would be a resource. I think that's
Yes, great. Thank you. Thank you. Other comments or questions? Yes.
In going through all the history and doing research, did you come across any information as to what motivated Roosevelt to sign that 1936 order, whether it was events or a group of people, or, I mean, that is so bizarre.
Okay, can I, just to be clear, okay? The experience in Hawaii resulted from martial law, okay? On December 7th, martial law was put into effect, and that was the basis on which all of the internees in Hawaii were picked up. Executive Order 9066 came about in February of the following year, I believe.
February 42.
42. And that was sort of a mandate, or mandated that all Japanese on the West Coast primarily were to be relocated. Okay, so what was Roosevelt thinking?
Well, they had lists for Hawaii. They had 4 lists, and they had done surveillance on the Japanese community since 1939. And they had them ready to go. And this is why December 7th, they could go and start to pick up these people who they felt, you know.
I mean, I think it's a good question, and there's not a clear answer. I will say a couple of things. Number one, in 1980, there was a congressional commission that investigated the facts and circumstances surrounding the decision to remove Japanese from the West Coast, the decision to detain them, the decision to imprison them, and so on. And the federal commission determined that it was war, racism, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. And I think that really does capture it very succinctly. You know, in the late 30s and the 1940s, it was a time where there was Japanese Americans, especially on the West Coast, had no allies.
Right.
It was following the anti-Chinese sentiment, this very anti-Japanese climate in California. There were already a number of anti-Asian laws and legislation adopted in California. Japanese could not own land, Japanese could not become citizens. There was an attempt to segregate young Japanese students in San Francisco schools. There was a tremendous amount of political pressure in California and within the state of California, and also with the congressional delegation, that Japanese should be rounded up, Japanese could not be trusted, and so on. So it was the political climate. There were just no political allies.
Well, my question was whether William Randolph Hearst had.
Oh, certainly William Randolph Hearst and the papers were very big in promoting that anti-Asian sentiment. And I will say, you know, what I found is in the 1940s, if you go back to the 1940s, you'll find there was tremendous amount. Public opinion was against the Japanese living on the West Coast. And I will say, though, that in the 1980s, when the effort for redress and reparations and the congressional apology, the movement to seek a congressional apology, the tide turned, and people were at a place where they could make amends, they could apologize, they recognized the wrong that was committed, again, towards Japanese Americans during World War II. But yes, the press was very much opposed to Japanese living on the West Coast.
Also in Hawaii, the Japanese population was so integrated into the community. And at that time, there were many people who vouched for the loyalty of their workers. Plantation managers vouched for my uncle, and so he was not interned. And if you read Reverend Osumi's book, Today's Thought, he had the Kauai community, he had the sheriff, he had everyone, 3 or 5 plantation managers vouching for him, and the local hearing, you know, detained.
They simply could not afford to round up en masse Japanese in Hawaii. They just could not.
What was the percentage of Japanese population in Hawaii then? The film said it was 40% about 10 years earlier. Was it up to 50%?
It was about, I think it was about 45%. Yeah, 45%.
Yeah, but just 1% of the population, Japanese, were interned from Hawaii, whereas it was 120,000 along the West Coast.
Yes.
Do you know about Roy Miyake's project here?
Roy's project.
Yes. We've worked, and he's worked with us.
But I'm wondering if you could tell the audience.
Oh, sure. Well, Roy has done a good deal of research on the Kauai internees, and he has a database, and he has tried to track the movements, just, you know, of the internees to the various sites. And if you go to the Kauai Museum, he does volunteer there, so you can ask him to get a look at his database, yes.
He has photos at the museum of Issei from this island who were sent to the Santa Fe Department of Justice. It wasn't a camp, it was a prison. And he has the names of 60 Kauai
Thank you, and I hope everyone heard that. If you have a moment, drop by the Kauai Museum, Historical Museum, and take a look at that photo. See if you can identify your family members. I want to thank you once again for joining us this afternoon. We will be here for a few more minutes.
We'd like the teachers.
Betsy and Lloyd would like to meet with any of the teachers to talk about, we'd like to get the curriculum materials in your hands, into your classrooms. If we can get the teachers to meet, that would be wonderful, and we will be out in the lobby as well. Thank you again. Thank you.